The New Covenant is a concept that is greatly debated in the Christian world, and in these studies we want to see whether or not God's law, the Sabbath, and the Old Covenant were really done away with at the cross. There are many people who claim that the Sabbath no longer needs to be kept because they believe that the law of God was nailed to the cross. But is this really true? Did God really do away with a law that He spoke Himself and personally wrote on tables of stone? These series of Bible studies are meant to address the errors in those ideologies and establish what the covenants were really about. If you have a Bible with you, I exhort you to use it to see if these things are really so. What is interesting is that the New Covenant was first mentioned in the Old Testament, but some of you might just be wondering, what in the world is a covenant? Well, a covenant is a written agreement or promise, usually under seal between two or more parties, especially for the performance of some action. Now in the Bible, what we see is that the Old Covenant and the New Covenant was ratified with blood. In the Old Covenant, Moses did it using the lambs, the blood of lambs, and in the New Covenant, we see it by the blood of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. When was the Old Covenant instituted? Turn to the book of Exodus, chapter 19, verse 16 to 19. And it reads, "And it came to pass on the third day in the morning, that there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud upon the mountain, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mount. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. And the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. And when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spake, and God answered him by voice." And so we see here that God actually descended on Mount Sinai and spoke the covenant. Now, in the book of Deuteronomy, it also states that He has descended with 10,000 of His saints. This was a huge thing. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verse 18 to 22, it says, "For ye are not come unto the mount that might be touched, and that burned with fire, nor unto blackness and darkness and tempest, and the sound of a trumpet, and the voice of words, which voice they that heard entreated that the word should not be spoken to them any more. For they could not endure that which was commanded. And if so much as a beast touch the mountain, it shall be stoned or thrust through with a dart. And so terrible was the sight, that Moses said, I exceedingly fear and quake." What is interesting is that even Moses himself, at this magnificent sight, as God Himself descended upon Mount Sinai with 10,000 of His saints, is something that should take our attention to what was the real details of the Old Covenant. Could it really be that the Old Covenant was just washed away, as if it was some unimportant thing, or is there something more to what the Old Covenant really entailed? In the book of Exodus, chapter 19, verse 5 through 8, it says, "Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and an holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel." And Moses came and called for the elders of the people, and laid before their faces all these words which the Lord commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, "All that the Lord hath spoken we will do." And Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord. And so here we see that the Lord is speaking to the people and affirmed the words of the covenant. This happened at Mount Sinai, and after that the 10 Commandments were spoken and then given to Moses. So what we want to see now is, how was the Old Covenant confirmed? How was it actually instituted? Because to understand the Old Covenant would understand what the New Covenant is, and whether or not the Sabbath, the law, and all these things are still needful for the Christian today. In the book of Exodus, chapter 24, verse 8, it says, "And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, Behold the blood of the covenant which the Lord hath made with you concerning all these words." And so here what we see is that Moses sprinkled the blood, just as we spoke before, that it was ratified with blood. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 9, verse 19, verse 20 and 20, it says, "For when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and of goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book and all the people. What's interesting is that that word book is boldface for a reason. We will get back to it later on into the study. But continuing, verse 20, it says, saying this is the blood of the testament which God hath enjoined unto you. Now, one of the main popular views that I've mentioned before is that people think that the Old Covenant was the Ten Commandments, and because the Old Covenant is done away with, the Ten Commandments have been obliterated. Now, it's true that the Ten Commandments are a part of the Old Covenant, and that God himself even says that. We will see that as we go on. So, but we're going to break down the very elements of the Old Covenant. Was it just the Ten Commandments, or was it more into it? So what I've done, I've broken it up into 4 clear pieces that the Bible identifies. First is the promises. We want to know who made the promises in the Old Covenant. Well, turning to the book of Exodus chapter 19, verse 5 through 8. And in reality, we're just going to read verse 8. It says, and all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord hath spoken, we will do. And Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord. So here we see that God speaks the covenant, but the people say, and they promise that whatever God has said, we will do it. The promises are with the people in the Old Covenant. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 5, verse 29, we see that again. This is after the second rendition of the law given in the book of Deuteronomy, which literally means the second reading of the law. In verse 29 of chapter 5, it says, and the Lord heard the voice of your words, when ye spake unto me. And the Lord said unto me, I have heard the voice of the words of this people which they have spoken unto thee. They have well said all that they have spoken. And so here we see again, we see that the promises was made and affirmed by the people. The people are promising to keep the law or the Ten Commandments that God spoke from Sinai. Now we're going to look at what were the conditions and the content of the Old Covenant. The book of Deuteronomy chapter 4 verse 13, it says, and he declared unto you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, even 10 commandments, and he wrote them upon 2 tables of stone. So yes, the 10 commandments are clearly shown to be part of the Old Covenant, but in there we see the people promised to keep the words of the covenant, which were the 10 commandments. Continuing, what was the covenant actually written on? In the book of Exodus 34, verse 28, they were written on tables. It says, and he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He did neither eat bread nor drink water. And when he wrote upon the tables the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments. So the 10 commandments represented the words of the covenant written on tables of stone, promised by the people to keep. So far, we have 3 conditions again: the promises, the content and conditions, and the tables which it was written upon. Now, the source of power in order to keep these commandments was supposed to be given by God. But what is interesting is, again, it's the promise of the people. Exodus 24, verse 7 says, and he took the book of the covenant and read in the audience of the people, and they said, all that the Lord hath said, we will do, and be obedient. What is interesting is the same promises that were stated are now restated in the book of Exodus, but along with it, highlighted and italicized, the book of the covenant. We see the covenant was written on stone, but then there was also a book of the covenant, a table and a book. Why were there 2? In the book Deuteronomy chapter 31 verse 26, it says, take this book of the law and put it in the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against thee. The book of the law was placed on the side of the ark, and the book of the law is the same as the book of the covenant. In the book of Deuteronomy chapter 10 verse 2 and 5, it says, and I will write on the tables the words that were in the first tables which thou breakest, and thou shalt put them in the ark. And I, Moses, turned myself and came down from the mount and put the tables in the ark which I had made. And there they be as the Lord commanded me. So here we see the tables of the covenant, which had the 10 commandments, were placed inside of the ark. And the book of the law, or the book of the covenant, was placed on the side of the ark. We see 2 different things here. Now, the book of the law is there to actually be their power, their source of righteousness. In the book of Romans 10, verse 5, it says, "For Moses describeth the righteousness which is of the law." The question is, which law? Is it the law in the Ten Commandments, or is it the law in the books? But it says, continuing, that the man which doeth these things shall live by them. Now, Paul quoted directly from the book of Leviticus. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 18, verse 4 to 5, it says, "Ye shall do my judgments, and keep mine ordinances, to walk therein. I am the Lord your God." In verse 5, it says, "Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. I am the Lord." This is directly and exactly the same as what Paul is saying in Romans chapter 10. So the righteousness that the children of Israel were to keep was to come from the book of the law, the book of the covenant. So the book of the covenant was going to be their way of keeping the Ten Commandments. There was their power, their empowerment, their righteousness. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 1, and also verse 25, it'll do you well to read that whole chapter. But in verse 1, we see that Moses actually states what the chapter is about, the statutes, the judgments, and etc. And starting in verse 24, it says, "And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as it is at this day. And it shall be our righteousness if we observe to do these commandments before the Lord our God as he hath commanded us." Now that verse is letting us know that it's their righteousness if they can keep it. And what's interesting is it's the statutes. And in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 10, it tells us where the statutes were written. These same statutes that would give them righteousness in order to keep the commandments is said in this verse. "If thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep his commandments and his statutes, which are written in this book of the law. And if thou turn unto the Lord thy God with all thine heart and with all thy soul." And so what we see here is that the statutes are written in the book. The book is going to help the people to have righteousness to keep the Ten Commandments. The power was by them saying that they will do it. So the question is then, why did the old covenant fail? What is directly related to the very things and the conditions of the old covenant. In the book Hebrews chapter 4, verse 2, it says, "For unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it." In Romans chapter 10, verse 3 to 5, it says, "For they being ignorant of God's righteousness, and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness." The law for righteousness was the law, the book of the covenant, not the Ten Commandments. The book of righteousness, the book of the law of righteousness was that which was placed in the side of the ark. Now it continues, "For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone that believeth. For Moses describeth the righteousness which is of the law, that the man which doeth those things shall live by them." In the New Testament now, the Old Testament is amplified. It tells us literally what the new covenant and why the old covenant failed. In Hebrews 8, verses 6 through 8, it says, "But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. For finding fault with them, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah." And so what we see here in Romans chapter 10 and also in Hebrews chapter 8 is that the problem was with the people, not the old covenant. The people had made promises that they could not keep. The new covenant now is going to be established on better promises according to this, because he had found fault with them. Now what question should be, what was the fault that he saw in them? In Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 27 to 29, it says, "Go thou near, and hear all that the Lord our God shall say, and speak thou unto us all that the Lord our God shall speak unto thee, and we will hear it and do it. And the Lord heard the voice of your words when you spake unto me. And the Lord said unto me, I have heard the voice of the words of this people, which they have spoken unto thee. They have well said, oh, they have spoken. Oh, that there was such an heart in them that they would fear me, and keep all my commandments always, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. And so what we see basically is that they did not have a proper heart to keep the law of God. No sinful person can keep God's law. God's law is a holy law, and unholy people cannot keep it. The problem with the Israelites, as we read in the book of Romans, is that they were not exercising faith. They thought that an unclean thing could keep a holy law of God, and they were not realizing that their promises were preventing them from doing it. What they needed was a new heart. And some of the Old Testament people have actually experienced it. We know Enoch experienced it. We know that Abraham experienced it. Even Moses experienced it, and David and other members. But the people as a whole were not fully getting the trueness of it. And this is why in Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 26 and 27, the Lord says this, a new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you. And I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you an heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you shall keep my judgments and do them. Now notice that he says that this new heart will cause them now to keep the same statutes that was written in the book of righteousness. This is why Romans comes true that says that the righteousness of the Lord will be fulfilled in us who walk after the Spirit. Any type of mindset where we say that, Lord, I won't do this anymore. Lord, I promise to be a better person, is an old covenant mindset. There are many Christians who claim to be new covenant Christians who still make old covenant promises. There is none righteous, no, not one. And any person who's trying to, out of the goodness of their heart, bring forth righteousness is doing an impossibility. Anytime we sin and we fall short, and then we make the promise that we are going to do better, we will fall short again. What we have to realize is that we need a new heart. We need to have a different covenant experience, and that is the experience we're going to talk about when we talk about what is the actual new covenant. We're going to do that in part 2 of this video.